Behind the bars, the Star Child. He who came first. The one who is the basis for us. For all of us. Says one word. Podcast. There is no fear in his voice. No despair. It is a simple statement of fact.
That's great. Welcome to Spawnography, everybody. Episode 5. I'm Pierce with...
I'm George. What's happening, Hellspawn?
And we're here to talk about Spawn a little bit more. If you've been with us the past few episodes, you'll know that we are in the middle of something called, by Terry Fitzgerald, the CoCoSwiss.
The Todd McFarlane Big Bad Barbecue All-Star Riders Super Slam Jam.
And this is a series of 4 issues where Todd asked some comic book superstars and folks that he admires to write an issue of Spawn. So issue 8, which we covered in episode 2, was Alan Moore. Issue 9 was Neil Gaiman. We covered that last issue. And last episode, this one is Dave Sim, and the following issue number 11, will be Frank Miller. So we're almost through the CoCoSwiss before Todd takes over writing duties again. And we kind of touched on this before. This was a big response to people saying that Todd sucked at writing, and the critical response to the early issues of Spawn being pretty negative. Fans, I mean, it sold a lot of copies, so and Spawn looks cool. So Spawn is selling comics, but Todd wants to do better.
He wants to prove the haters wrong. So we're not just going to breeze past the Dave Sim of it all. We're going to go ahead and right at the top address the fact that Dave Sim sucks as a person.
Yeah.
Not long after this issue was published, which he wrote, he started getting into some very, frankly, kind of violent, anti-feminist, misogynist viewpoints that became, I guess, to him an important part of his work, including his creator-owned title Cerebus and some of the things he did afterwards. It's tough. We're not going to give a platform to those views, and we're not going to dig too deep into who Dave Sim is now, because it's just honestly all you need to know, and you can look it up yourself very easily, is that it's violently misogynist, anti-woman, anti-feminist, and it sucks. It sucks that he is that person. He also is kind of a sex pest. He, by his own admission, I think, groomed a woman from age 14 until she was 18 and began a sexual relationship with her. I guess I should have trigger warning that. But we're not going to go into it any deeper than this.
Yeah, we can understand. I mean, what we will get into is Dave Sim is a fellow Canadian. At the time, he's writing the longest running comic or actually, I think he's still, I wonder if Eric Larson's passed him at this point with Savage Dragon. It's debatable. But at the time, the longest running indie comic by a single writer artist, he kind of kept control of his thing. He never sold out, as for whatever that's worth. But Cerebus was always his creation. You can understand why Todd looks at Cerebus and says, look at this cool, like, insightful and witty comic, because it is a satire. Cerebus is an aardvark. He's kind of a Conan riff for a while. He's like an aardvark barbarian. But Dave Sim would kind of take a piss and he'd be Wolverine for an issue or whatever. And very satirical, kind of wry. It's humor that has not necessarily aged well. And given his views later on, the book has become unreadable to many people. This was a book that would sell around 30 to 35,000 copies at the time of this issue coming out, which pretty big deal for a book like a black and white indie comic that doesn't have the distribution of a Marvel or DC or even a Malibu or an Image, or who's getting distributed by Malibu at this point. So the fact that he's really doing the whole pulling himself up by his bootstraps thing, it makes sense that it's somebody that Todd would gravitate towards and that he would tap for this sort of let me bring in people that I admire to make Spawn comics thing.
How much the person he became is the person he was at that time is we'll never know.
It's unclear.
He didn't start expressing that in his work until a few years after this.
Yeah.
In no way are we interested in separating the art from the artist or excusing those things and just pretending that they don't exist. This work kind of addresses something totally different. It's also a very political issue. It's more about creators' rights, which is kind of the thing that really unites Todd and Dave Sim. That's what really unites them, is their passion for their creator-owned rights for their characters. And that's really what this issue is about. Before we get super into it, I'll let Pierce read the credits as usual. But yeah, we're not trying to breeze over that or pretend that's not who Dave Sim is or who he became or what his work became about and has been about for a long time. You can read more about it at your peril. It just sucks.
Yeah. We're not interested in getting too deep into it because this is a Spawn podcast. We'll talk about it as it relates to the issue at hand, and I'm sure we're going to touch on it at least a couple of more times because I do think there are a couple of things that are interesting to that end. But anyway, this is issue 10 of Spawn. It's called Crossing Over. Story by Dave Sim, art by Todd McFarlane, letters and editor Tom Orzechowski, colors by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rude, and Ollie Optics. This one is dedicated to Don Heck.
Oh, wow. You know what?
Yeah,
Based opinion. Thank you, Based Todd.
pretty
And
cool.
I'm only saying that because Don Heck is an incredibly underrated contributor to early Marvel Comics, and in my opinion, a fantastic cartoonist. I just wanted to get that out there.
I think that in a lot of ways, and we've talked about those dedications a little bit as they've come up in these issues, like as folks who grew up buying CDs at least from Sam Goody or whatever, you'd buy your favorite records or new record by band you like, and you'd go into the credits and the thank yous and be like, who did they thank? And then go look up those bands and stuff. And in a way, this is kind of that version of that,
Absolutely.
right? It's like dedicated Don Heck. It doesn't say anything else. It doesn't say what he did. Got to go find out who Don Heck is. Todd McFarlane likes him. Like, I think that's really cool. And I like, I don't know. I'm
I like
endeared
it
to
quite a
that.
bit, especially Don Heck. I mean, like I said, I'm a sucker. It does sound like something Hank Hill would do. Don Heck.
So we get into this issue, and the first page. I mean, I'm gonna say Todd. He does some
He's
good stuff
really
here.
enjoying getting weird with it, and the art in this issue is very
Yeah,
abstract because it's an abstract issue. And one reason for that is that it seems to be a dream sequence, and it's not exactly clear where it happens, but if we judge by the previous issue with Angela in it, there is a sequence where Spawn is asleep in the alley in a bunch of bags of trash, and he's dreaming of a panel from this issue. So we can assume it's a
right.
dream he had during that issue. It's also possible that was a premonition of this adventure, and this is something that happened to him after being seemingly vaporized by Angela's lance as the cliffhanger of issue number 9. But
Yeah,
it's not really clear. It is very psychedelic and dreamy throughout.
yeah. And the first two lines, "I am Spawn, I am not Spawn." We kind of get the page split down the middle with the mirror image of Spawn, essentially. The first read I had on this is the continuing understanding of the parasite that is the Spawn suit.
Right.
But the other way is that I kind of read it as Dave Sim saying, like, I am Todd McFarlane, I am not Todd
And also,
McFarlane.
I am both this character because I'm giving voice to the character, and I'm not the character because I'm the creator. And that duality of viewpoints becomes kind of the crux of the issue. There are times when the not Spawn, quote unquote, narrator will say, I know things Spawn doesn't, I have powers Spawn doesn't have, but even there are things that I don't know. And I think that's also speaks to that layer of it that is, I'm Dave Sim, not Todd McFarlane, just kind of putting that as a layer of the subtext, I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, and the interesting thing on here is that we see a child and a woman that we've never seen before throughout any of the issues. Kind of their headshots. Interestingly, this kind of looks like another cover. It doesn't, like this image in general, but we get a floating head of the Violator, we get a skull, and we get this woman and this baby that
But
we've never seen before.
interestingly, the narrator who says, "I am not Spawn," in part of the captions where it's doubled up and it says, "I am," it says, "I remember my slash his death." And then he also says, "I know Wanda and I know Cyan." And that's not the Wanda and Cyan we've seen in comics before. We'll learn a little bit more about who they are and where they
Right.
come from. But I think there is also another part of that layer of like, I know these people. I'm Dave Sim and I know these people because I know Todd McFarlane. But also it's that multi-layered text, which, not to give, Dave Sim too much credit, but it is an interesting device that continues throughout the issue. I do think that it's something that works on those levels throughout, and there are just all these little. I won't slow things down too much by pointing all of them out, but I think that's an important one because it gives you another bit of understanding that also, I think, and this is something that is put in very graphic detail at the end of the issue, there's a sense that Dave Sim is saying, I don't own Spawn, but I'm writing Spawn.
And also a little bit of it through this narration that kind of says, I've talked to Todd. He talks about knowing when Sam and Twitch will finally meet Spawn, why Twitch is called Twitch, the histories of all of the friends and things, like conversations that
I
he's
also
had
think that works
outside of what the
exactly.
book
And
is.
I also think that works on the level of kind of just a vaguely omniscient narrator. It establishes that that's what we have.
Right.
He's not going to tell us these things because we're going to find out in due time, but it's also teasing us that these are things that are kind of interesting to know.
To this point, the first few pages, Sim's really just taking us through what we generally know about Spawn. We see all the characters that we met so far. We see Tony Twist. Excuse me. What's his name again?
Vito
Vito.
Gravano, Vito Dracula Gravano.
Right. We see Al in his original, pre-Spawn form. We see the tower from Alan Moore's Spawn number 8, and we are reminded that we know about every level except for level 7. That's called
Interestingly
Erebus,
enough, Cerebus,
obviously.
Erebus. You have to imagine
Right.
that they thought that was very clever. The other thing that's interesting on the left side of the spread here is it says, when Spawn goes to Al Simmons' grave one day and strips away the sod and digs down through the dark earth and opens the lid of Al Simmons' coffin, I know what he'll find there. And that's interesting because it gives us this foreshadowing of something directly that is probably going to happen in Spawn at some point. And it's that interesting aspect of the whole CoCoSwiss where every one of them adds something to Spawn's mythos, a layer to who Spawn is and his mythology that is going to be picked up and run with later. And this is something that maybe Todd told, Dave Sim that's something that's going to happen. Maybe Dave asked, but is also could be something that he just wrote poetically, knowing Todd would pick up the baton and run with it because that's how often superhero comics work, and that's also how the CoCoSwiss has worked so far, especially with a lot of the mythos that was laid down by Neil Gaiman in issue number 9 preceding this. And we got in depth about that in the last episode, so if you want more info, definitely go give that a listen.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is that the I am not Spawn is kind of back in hell, as we saw in issue 8, and he's teleported back to that door for level 7, right? Into that tower, and he's at level 7, and he's going to. The teleporting doesn't matter. We never see the power meter in
Yeah.
this issue because not Spawn doesn't need it. It does not apply to him.
Yeah, again, and theoretically that could be because the suit has powers of its own, as we've learned previously, that don't use the counter, don't take away from Spawn's limits. But it also could be, again, that layer of I'm the creator, I'm the narrator, my powers are limitless. Whatever I say happens in this comic is what happens.
Yeah. And so as Not Spawn kind of moves into level 7, he sees a bunch of hooded figures with their hands bound behind them. This is where the narration stuff starts to outstay its welcome a little bit. I don't think it's quite as clever as it is and effective as it is early
No,
on.
it's just kind of rapid fire and choppy, and it's just basically Dave Sim describing what Todd McFarlane drew.
Yeah, and
We
it
don't learn
doesn't
much about it.
doesn't really need.
We just know that these are the level 7, the first chamber is full of hooded figures. So it's funny just to note, Pierce alluded to it back in issue number 8, which was the second part of the Billy Kincaid saga where he ventures through hell. It says no one knows what's in level 7, written by Alan Moore. So that's something where Alan Moore was setting up, this teeing up this idea, and Dave Sim just a couple issues later is kind of directly addressing it with something that ultimately becomes almost kind of a punchline in a weird way.
Yeah, and this is it's something that we talked about in an earlier episode about like, well, okay, how much of Spawn does Todd have planned out? Because the way that Todd writes specifically, he spends so much time recapping himself and spending time like making sure that you remember exactly what
Yeah.
Spawn's deal is, and kind of kvetching about his wife, that like the plot never moves forward. However, once we get to the CoCoSwiss, we are like getting through some stuff, and it's unclear where Todd ends and those writers start, especially something here where it feels like I'm almost certain that Alan Moore and Dave Sim did
No,
not have a
absolutely not.
conversation about Spawn.
No, I don't think so. But
You
it makes
know,
you wonder if Todd had some kind of document that he gave them all, or if he had, like the bare minimum plot of an idea laid out, or gave them just, these tidbits to sprinkle out. Doesn't really matter. It's kind of interesting that the baton is getting passed from writer to writer in the CoCoSwiss. The CoCoSwiss.
yeah. So this is going to lead to our, a pretty iconic double page spread. This is the page that we saw a breakdown of in issue 9, when Spawn was dreaming. Um, he sees the hooded figures. We turn the page. He says, "I want to know everything," and we see a bunch of hands reaching through bars. We can't see anything more, but they are familiar
Yeah, we
hands.
see the Juggernaut, the
Um,
Flash, the Thing, Doctor Doom, Superman, Spider-Man, Thor, Joker, Batman, Wolverine, Captain America, Wonder Woman, Shazam, Hulk, among others. There are more. It's a pretty big. Venom
yeah,
is right there. Interesting that Todd definitely put that Spider-Man hand front and center. He probably got a little kick out of throwing that in there. But they're all hands of familiar superheroes, and the text also name checks a lot of characters: champions, Watchmen, Avengers, Defenders, Men of Steel, Women of Tomorrow, Gods of Thunder, Crusaders. Watchmen is an interesting one because I think it's a nod primarily to Alan Moore basically saying like, yeah, you got screwed, because what this will become is a peon about creators' rights.
and at this point too, Alan Moore's unfortunate deal with DC would be pretty well
He wasn't
known. I
quiet
mean,
about it at any point, I don't think.
yeah. For anybody that doesn't know, very quick recap on that. Alan Moore ends up doing Watchmen with DC. Originally, it's meant to be a DC
And
story.
of course, credit to Dave Gibbons for Watchmen as well. Can't let that
Right,
pass.
of
But
course. And John Workman on letters,
yes,
right?
of course.
So Alan Moore, I forget the name of the original pitch now, but it had DC characters. It was Superman, it was Batman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. DC editors are like, you can't do this with our characters.
So he tried to do it
He
with the
goes,
Charlton
okay,
characters.
right, because they just purchased them, and this is pre-Crisis, so they had not been fully like integrated into the DCU yet, and so that's like your Captain Adams and
Blue
your Blue
Beetle, yeah.
Beetles, etc.
Phantom
The
Lady, The
Question
Question,
also,
yeah.
and they go, "Oh no, 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 we have got plans for those characters. You can't use those either. But we like your story. Just make up your own characters."
So he
He makes up his own characters, and the deal is,
kind of sands off
okay,
the like edges of the Charlton characters. Rorschach is like The Question, Night Owl's like Blue Beetle, etc.
right? Dr. Manhattan is Captain Atom,
Yeah.
right? And the deal is, and I'm paraphrasing here, so if this is at all incorrect, whatever, figure it out. Google it yourself. But they say, like, hey, we'll put this out and then you'll get the rights back once the trade goes out of print. Like, we're going to print it as like a book. You'll get the rights once it goes out of print.
Grinch smile creeps across their face.
Well, I do think that that was probably a deal made in good faith at a time when this is, 1986 becomes
Right.
like a watershed year for comic books in general, being taken a little bit more seriously as art or things that adults can read.
The good faith reading is they were thinking there would be perhaps 2 to 3 newsstand printings, direct market printings, like of the individual issues, maybe a collection. But comics weren't really being collected very commonly at that point, and the ones that were not being collected in formats that are super familiar to us now. There are a few trade paperbacks. That was kind of the era that it started. But yeah, it's likely that, the charitable reading is that DC wasn't thinking, well, this will become one of the most popular comic book stories of all time that will perpetually be in print in multiple formats and that will continually revisit for decades, enraging Alan Moore.
Yeah, and so he never gets the rights back because giving him the rights back to Watchmen is like burning money for DC and especially now Warner Brothers, right? So
Right.
he's never getting the rights back. He's never done anything else with Watchmen. He quits DC soon after this. And that's what leads to this like interesting 90s era of Alan Moore just like doing Supreme, and he does like this issue of Spawn, and not this one, issue 8 of Spawn, and America's Best Comics
That came a
also
little later because I
would
was
be
actually
later. It's like
part of
early
Wildstorm, I
2000s.
think, at the time. And then
Yeah.
Wildstorm, it doesn't matter. That's a whole different history. But so Dave Sim mentioning Watchmen here is definitely a signal that this is about creators' rights. Also, though, when I first read it, and I've seen this page before many, many, many times, but when I was reading it this time in context, the first time I read Watchmen, my first thought was, did Dave Sim not get what Watchmen was about? Which I think is the funnier reading of it. But no, it's definitely a nod to creators' rights.
Yeah.
So he mentions, all these characters, alludes to these Marvel and DC characters. We see their hands, which are just, essentially kind of nods to these characters.
Yeah, and we get a little bit of a nod, the specific nod to Watchmen, the help us, save us, and Spawn is the one that yells no. Not unlike,
No. And so also the people with hoods over their heads behind him are all weeping at these people who are crying for justice. Help us, please save us.
yeah, and so not Spawn unleashes his power on the cage before him, and he has more power than the Spawn that we're used to, and so he just really his power is basically infinite, and he there's no effect,
Yeah. He
and the
unleashes this
hands.
massive wave. This is a great page from Todd McFarlane, I think, with that kind of cascading panel structure where he's just pouring more and more energy.
Yeah.
And then,
Well, and you know what? I've been a little harsh on him before for sort of copy pasting certain panels, and so it's nice that like this is not one of those times.
no, that's why it's so effective, is that
Yeah.
it's kind of, it's almost a cinematic, it feels almost like a camera move. In a way, it almost feels like one of those, because of the kind of curved nature of the lettering from superstar Tom Orzechowski
Hmm.
and the the curved, kind of cascading nature of the panels. It almost has that matrix like sweeping around quality. Way before that, I don't think it's trying to ape that or innovating that. I think it just now in retrospect has that vibe, and I like that.
Yeah. And I like the last panel as well, where Spawn is framed between two bars.
Yeah, so it almost shows that he's
But there's no effect, and yeah, it gives the effect that like, well, Spawn is also kind of trapped here too,
in a
in a
way,
way.
but he's trapped on the other side.
Right.
They're telling him after he unleashes his power, they're all telling him, take our power. And he says, I can hear their voices in my head. And they said 10,000, 1,000 voices, take our power. Our power is yours, Spawn. And on the next page, we see a figure that's essentially very familiar to us.
Another hero with a big red cape. And I will say the Todd
Santa
McFarlane
Claus
smile.
man. He does. He has that hellish, like hellspawn Todd McFarlane smile. He does.
But yeah, I mean, it's Superman, and he's saying to Spawn that it's now or never. The power, my power is yours, Spawn. Take it. In a way, I do feel like this is Dave Sims slash Todd saying like, no, like we're the future. Image Comics is the future. There is an end. There's like no end to what like corporate superhero comics can't do the things that we can do. They used to be able to, but now it's up to us. And it is this
Right.
passing of the baton.
It's something that's become very important to Todd McFarlane in more recent years in his philosophy of comics that he conveys in some ways, which is taking that popularity of these characters and concepts and kind of building on that with your own stuff. He was very successful with that with Spawn because he was kind of the prototype for that. Not saying he was the first creator on superhero, but he was the one in the 90s that really made it a more common thing to see throughout the industry and to see rise to the top more often in popularity and sales, etc., beyond just Marvel and DC.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've covered a few times before, we've already seen indie comics that sold like Ninja Turtles is a great example of this because it
Mm-hmm.
kind of only continues to exist because it sells out very quickly. Licensing becomes its thing. It has a TV show very quickly. It gets its edges
Infinity $1 million
sanded down.
in toy sales.
Yeah. But it gets
But
its edges sanded off almost instantly because that's the best way to repackage that thing and like make it wildly popular. Whereas like Spawn, especially early issues of Spawn, they sell really well.
the toys kind of take that same baton of the Ninja Turtles and say, well, I can do it without making it about, four cartoon, wackadoo dudes eating pizza. Like
Right,
mine won't be Looney Tunes. Mine will be, Hammer horror still.
right. I really love this Superman page. I think it's so cool, and I absolutely love the next page. We've talked about Todd really loving all the hand imagery, and there's tons of it in this issue. Obviously, I love these like cosmic
The
hands.
one thing I do love that hand. Okay, let's talk about the hands first. Love the hands. Love that Todd drew like Earth and the moon in there instead of just doing like the star splatter.
Yeah,
The thing I want to draw your attention to is that in the top left of that page, Spawn is Jesus, which is just sending that metaphor home so hard. It's a full on Man of Steel, like arms out in the the cross pose, glowing white Spawn with like this halo of energy around him and his big lighter colored pink cape. And I think, knowing Todd, I have no fucking idea if that's him having a little bit of a sarcastic like moment with the metaphor, or if he was like, oh yeah, Spawn's Jesus, I'm gonna go ahead and put that on the page.
so here's the thing. I think that this is where that split between Spawn and not Spawn is. This is Todd. Like
So
this is
Todd's Jesus, for Todd so loved the world that he gave
so
his
because
only
even the
begotten
captioning
Spawn.
exactly, and the caption kind of works here. Their power flows into me, surging through every limb. My power, which I had thought to be unlimited, is as nothing compared to this.
And he says, when I'm not unlimited, he says I am not Spawn. He
Right? He's
clarifies.
reminding us that like this
But
is
this is
not
the
just the Spawn character.
first time though that not Spawn says my power is not unlimited.
Yeah, well, he right, which is that a reference to like, well, I think that I can do all these things because I am inspired by the things that came before me. However, I learned very quickly that I am not up to the task quite yet. That like these issues, especially where he's bringing in outside writers, right? To me, I read it as like Todd admitting a little bit in the text of this. I know that Dave is the writer, but Orzakowski is the letter and editor. So I have to imagine that there's been some massaging of what's gone on here because Orzakowski's been along for the ride the entire time. And as we kind of discussed, Todd must have discussed some of this
Sure. Well, either way,
and
it's
he
on the
saw the
page.
script. Right.
So the question is, is that Dave Sim kind of parsing down a lesson to Todd somewhat, saying like, I've been doing this creator own thing a lot longer than you.
Right.
you're not as invincible as you think. Is it Todd acknowledging that with the CoCoSwiss? Is it a third secret thing? But it's there, and that metaphor does work. I still think it's funny that Spawn is Jesus here.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I love I also I'm such a sucker for any starry, spacey,
Oh yeah,
you know, Jim Starlin-esque,
and
Ron
it is a
Lim,
very
Silver
Starlin
Surfer.
kind of look here
Yeah,
with that halo. I do like where he says, "My arms are the Earth and the stars and the planets and all the galaxies that ever were or ever will be."
yeah.
Obviously, literally rendered here, but I think that's interesting both because it puts the focus on hands again. Todd's getting real good at drawing these cool outstretched claw hands, by the
Yeah,
way.
he's getting
Really
great at
digging
it.
these.
I should
And
never
I
have doubted him.
also, who you never doubt the Todd father. Honestly, would not bet against him unless it's in a lawsuit. Uh, also, you can take that literally by, my arms that draw and type. So anyway, another cool little piece of prose, I guess.
Yeah, but he uses this kind of power cosmic once again to strike on the next double page spread, which feels like a deadline.
Yeah, it's definitely a big, I like the rocks in the foreground exploding outwards. It almost has that, what I do like about it? It almost has that Planet Krypton feel, which will
Yeah.
become relevant in a minute. So it does have that going for it. I think it's funny that we see basically here the metaphor is that for all the power you get from being creator owned, you can't free these other characters. You can't
Right.
save them, and you can't rectify the machinery that created those characters and those universes. You can't, you know, change the machine from within, which is something that Todd learned pretty firsthand and what led to starting Image Comics.
What's interesting about this is that it's before Spawn Batman, and so he almost kind of gets to do it, right? Sort of.
Right. He gets to pull in some characters, you
He
know.
talks about wanting to do like Spawn Spider-Man, like right off the bat. Once people
Oh
are like,
yeah.
kind of looks like Spider-Man. He's like, I would love to do Spawn and Spider-Man. That sounds great.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that, yeah, like you said, he is kind of admitting, oh, the thing that I thought I couldn't change the system from the inside. SLC Punk before SLC Punk.
I'm sure he'd love to do Spawn Spider-Man because I bet he'd love to do a Spider-Man comic that he owned part of.
Yeah,
That would be the
absolutely.
ultimate fuck you back to Marvel, I think, for him.
And I I love his weird demons. I love that after that big explosion we get.
The one Fleabiac sister, which is
Yeah, well,
Violator.
but it is not the Violator.
No, it's just the Violator's head on a twisted form of Lady Justice's body, where she's measuring scales with, someone's heart and big bags of money. And she's wearing a dress made of billions and billions of dollars. And boy, what do you think the metaphor here is in relation to this story? Because she's saying you failed and cackling at him. You failed, you failed, you failed, buddy boy. Todd loves to be condescending by calling people little buddy or buddy boy. And I think that's something we've seen repeated in the CoCoSwiss. And maybe it's all those guys calling Todd McFarlane little buddy, which would be funny to me. Um, Also, did they make an action figure of this? Because I would buy it.
I don't know. I don't think so. But if
Probably not, but
I
Todd, if
wonder,
you're
I
when
wonder if
you
somebody's
hear
done a
this,
custom.
I bet, yeah, I bet you could. All you need is billions of dollars for the dress.
One thing that I think, uh, to because the Hooded Men come back right after this, is are the Hooded Men specifically a reference to Watchmen in that Hooded Justice is one of the characters,
Probably, and they're calling justice, justice, and
right?
injustice. I don't think that would necessarily be out of bounds. What I do think is interesting is on the page opposite this, we see not Superman again. Every time we see him, it's, you can see his red arms and legs, or sorry, blue arms and legs and his red cape and the very distinctive spit
Spit
curl.
curl, yeah.
But the rest of him, anything that would be considered like a DC insignia or like DC property that would take this out of the realm of like kind of fair use
Yeah.
is bathed in shadow. And one thing that I think the thing that's interesting is he says, behind the bars, a star child, he who came first, the one who is the basis for us, for all of us. He says one word, doomsday. You heard that earlier, sort of. What I think is interesting about that is it's basically a direct reference to the fact that Doomsday and the death of Superman was this massive, unprecedented selling event that basically ensured that Marvel and DC would have a place in the pantheon of like ultra mega selling comics and in this speculation boom for the rest of the decade dominantly. It makes the idea of DC holding on to the rights of Superman for a very long time. We're soon going to get the Action Comics #1 version of Superman in public domain,
Oh yeah.
Steamboat Willie style. But it kind of cements that ownership of them saying, like, we can do anything we want and we can kill Superman. We can kill this character. And even when he's gone, we'll bring him back and it'll be even more important to fans. And it's that him just saying doomsday sells the point that it's about sales. It's about sales, and it's about what gimmick sells for these comics, and it's about what keeps those billions of dollars on the dress of the Violator Lady Justice, which
You
again
know,
I would buy an action figure of.
the other thing too is that I used to not like Superman when I was younger. I was a Marvel zombie through and through, and I was like, hate Superman. He's got all the powers. What's the point? And as I got older, I realized that like there's a reason that Superman is the first one and was so popular, and it's not because he can do everything. It's because the 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 internal struggle kind of Clark Kent is he can do anything. He chooses to do the right thing, and that is all that we can choose to do. And this page, this Doomsday, especially with the dollar bill lady injustice violator kind of next to him, right? And he says Doomsday is sort of like Todd and Dave Sim almost being like, this is the only these are the only people that could kill Superman. Like
And also, it traps him in the cage. I think you're exactly right.
I just think it's telling that this is they've these two creators have in this case. So I'm gonna parse it down to just these two creators have really said like, look, your heroes can be killed. They're not invincible, even when they're supposed to be, and it's up to us to try to build something bigger and better that can't be killed in the same way. I guess it's also a little bit Emma Frost. So you can't kill an idea,
Right.
but
Does it? So what I was going to say is, does this imply also that when Superman was dead, he was in the 7th level of hell? Is that the secret crossover with the death of Superman here? Yeah, I like that.
that'd be
Um,
kind of fun.
yeah, my roommate's going through a phase where he's really falling in love with Superman right now. And I think a lot of people go through a phase where they hate Superman because you hear it from fans still all the time, the common complaint of like, well, nothing hurts him. He's got, there's no conflict. He can do anything. He's invincible. And I think you're right. It's not about that because his immediate mega popularity came at a time when he wasn't necessarily invincible and couldn't do
Yeah,
anything. And the thing that made him so important and that I love about Superman is, and what was established in those early years, I think was the intent, is that the only people who should ever be afraid of Superman are people who are doing wrong.
yeah,
Superman is a friend to everyone who is not ultimately a villain. In those early years, that was, people who quashed labor organizers. It was, organized crime. It was corrupt officials, things like that.
yeah.
So I think, it's interesting to see the idea that Superman is also in hell, trapped in this cycle of, his life and death and taking him so far away from that concept that it's just about literally getting punched into the dirt.
Yeah. Well, and also that for all of his powers, he doesn't even try to get out.
Right.
Like, like he's not even trying to get out.
Not rolling
Um,
Ben bars, lift gates at all. He's got like a
yeah.
99th percentile. It's an AD&D joke from my old heads. So on the next page, we meet someone who's in the opposite position of Superman. He's in his own world
Yep.
that is on a path totally far out of hell. He's saying, I don't know what the Cerebus voice is, but he's saying, Spawn.
Yeah. So the book does transition to black and white, as was that was the style for Cerebus always.
We also get some interesting backgrounds here that are these like Xerox backgrounds, which I don't know if Dave Sim used that often, but I've
Yeah,
certainly seen it happen. And also kind of just a technique that was pioneered in modern comics by Jack Kirby and Jim Steranko. Just love seeing it used in such a cool way with Spawn with these halftones and everything.
we definitely are continuing to get. Todd gets a lot of expression out of Spawn's face. The narration is gone, and this is just all dialogue. Spawn is now one. He's talking to Cerebus. Cerebus is a little aardvark. I don't know. I didn't even look up what a real aardvark looks like. I don't know that Cerebus looks like an aardvark at all. To be honest, he looks like a little pig man.
Yeah, I think he's got a long nose that's like a snout, and he's got the little claws. So I guess, but like, yeah, it's a very cartoonized, like anthropomorphized,
Yeah.
very strange aardvark.
And Cerebus talks about how, Spawn really wants to save the folks behind the bars and the hooded figures. And Cerebus just says you can't, and it's best not to think about it. I've been here for 15 years.
Kind of
I
marking
know.
how long Dave Sim's been doing it.
Right.
And then so Spawn asks, "Who are they?" And Cerebus lays it out. They're superheroes. And I almost said Todd. Spawn asks, "And these men?" about the hooded men. And Cerebus says they're creators, the ones who sold them. Like Cerebus said, it's best not to think about it. And they're sobbing seeing their characters behind this. This is also at a time when lawsuits from the estates of like Jack Kirby, who is alive for a good chunk of those lawsuits, were kind of raging. And Jack Kirby was pioneering, along with Neil Adams and many other younger creators, an era of creators' rights that definitely fed into Todd leaving Marvel to co-found Image. He was riding a wave that was coming from people who were totally fucked over by massive corporations that were compounding wealth and interest in these characters without paying any dividend or share for the labor of the people that had not only created them but made them into characters and told the stories that people were in love with and set the foundation that was being carried by these other creators. And that was very prominent in comics at this time. I think this was, I want to say, right around the time that Jack Kirby died, too.
This would
Uh,
be about a year before because Jack dies in 94.
right.
This would be 93 still. But this is also
But he was very
only.
vocal about that also towards the
Oh,
end of
yeah.
his life. So this is a thing in comics, and we see those dedications at the beginning. Don Heck is a guy who got fucked a lot by Marvel.
Yeah. Well, and also this is we've invoked Chris Claremont's name on this podcast before. This is 2 years after he would have left X-Men, kind of unceremoniously. He would be back, but it would never be the same. Even through his run, editorial made mandates that he didn't agree with. He didn't want Jean Grey brought back. They brought Jean Grey back. That gets softened a little bit by the fact that Louise Simonson ends up taking over X Factor, but eventually Louise Simonson pushed out by
Yeah.
Marvel and is no longer an editor and ends up, ironically, for a book that references Doomsday, goes to work on the Death of Superman.
Mm-hmm. Also, just shout out to Louise Simonson and Walt Simonson. Just want to say,
Oh
two of
yeah.
the sweetest people in the industry.
If
Just
anybody
fantastic
knows
talents as
Simonson
well.
and they want to talk about Spawn with us, please let us know. I would love to
dude,
talk
I
about
would,
Spawn.
dude, I would love to see. I don't know if he ever did, but if Walt Simonson drew Spawn, that would be lit. Anyway,
I want to find a pinup. I think I think he's done a pinup, but I don't know that he's done a full issue.
makes sense.
But that would rule either way.
Yeah, but the idea here is that the creators that created these characters are now, they're basically, their hands are bound and they have to sob and see what happens to them as they're even killed off
Right.
and turned basically into commodities.
And it's
So
crazy because it's something that we still see to this day. To bring up Louis Simonson once again, At the time in the 80s when she creates Apocalypse, there was at least you would at least get a small share of the character. So if the character continued to appear in things, you get a little check. Apocalypse goes on to become one of the biggest characters in the X-Men pantheon of villains. She was not even thanked in X-Men Apocalypse the movie. She was not invited to the premiere.
Just another reason it was a piece of shit, unwatchable. Didn't thank Louise
Uh,
Simonson, unwatchable.
Chris Claremont didn't get invited to like the Wolverine movies. I watched the Wolverine and Chris Claremont at like a press screening that somebody had to invite Chris Claremont to, and he sat like 2 rows behind me.
And I bet he loved every minute of it.
No, he did not.
What?
I saw his face after, and he was like, "All right."
That movie, I don't want to go on too much of a diatribe, but I get why he hated it, because in that movie, Wolverine walks into a village full of ninjas and he has to fight his way to Ninja Castle, and all that happens is they shoot him with ropes. And it's not like
Yep.
he has some thing that cuts ropes right at hand, right available right there, literally at hand, in his hands, in his fucking hands, to just cut the ropes. I wanted to see the ninja fight. I wanted to see that, but I get it. Anyway, sorry. Diatribe over. We're not going to rant about comic book movies again ever on this podcast, I'm sure.
That'll never happen.
Right.
So yeah, anyway, Spawn meets Cerebus, and Cerebus speaks in the third person. I forget if that's a thing that Cerebus does. I guess it is.
That's fine.
He tells us where they are and kind of shows everything around. Shows Spawn around. It's just these 2 black and white pages.
I do like the one touch of color is the Spawn's
It's green of
eyes.
his eyes. Yeah,
When
I think that's
Todd
cool.
does that, like really another great Spawn reaction panel.
And he leads him to a house. And it's this, big house. And Cerebus says that it's got a nice view, a hot tub, a satellite dish, about 1 million hockey cards, which has to be just Canadians making jokes at each other. In this case, Dave and Todd.
Yeah, and also Todd loves sports. The
Yeah,
other thing
big
about Todd
sports
is before Spawn, he tried to make hockey cards. He tried to sell a line of hockey cards that would feature portraits of hockey players in the front and then caricatures of them drawn by him on the back. He tried to sell that to the NHL and it failed. And that is part of what led to him going back to comics. As I understand the timeline, that's part of what led to him going back to comics to found Image as his own comic book business. So that's another nod to the fact that, like, yeah, your dreams are stacked with hockey cards, but your life is built on comics.
Another instance of Todd being a little bit ahead of the curve is that in, I want to say, 2010, 2011, Sports Illustrated teamed up with Marvel artists to do
Yeah.
team previews with individual artists drawing each of the teams as like superhero, like they're superstars as superheroes.
I remember that. They've done a few things like that with different sports
Yeah.
organizations over the years now.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Todd was ahead of his time again.
But there's clearly that's something that Dave Sim knows about Todd,
Yeah, of
to
course.
put it in the script. So,
But leads him into this house, and he says to Spawn, you and Wanda have a daughter. Oh, he also says your wife will be home soon. Her name's Wanda too. No big surprise. She's a high school teacher, a real looker too. You'll see, and you're gonna love this. You and Wanda have a daughter, and Spawn starts crying.
and Spawn says, "How is this possible?" Because obviously Al Simmons was established that he wasn't able to father a child, at least with Wanda in life, and then she had a child with his best friend afterwards.
Right.
So he's very impressed by his own ability here. And this is another like Todd is Spawn as Todd is Spawn as Todd kind of Ouroboros moment. Also, I also like that, again, both Todd and Spawn's dream house has like a hot tub and hockey cards.
Yeah.
So,
and the baby's name obviously is Cyan. I like Cerebus's line, all babies look like Winston Churchill. It's kind of funny.
Yeah.
I chuckled.
Well, if babies would stop smoking cigars, maybe they'd look a little less like him. Spawn says, "How?" And Cerebus says, "Your creator's still with you. He didn't sell you. It's as simple as that." And I guess that means, I guess the message is like Todd's living large because he's raking in the profits from Spawn. There's some strangeness to that message, especially coming from a writer that isn't Todd. But I think the message is, the only way to really make a true living that you can count on in this business is by owning what you sell, you know.
I do think that this is a little bit of where we maybe start to see some of Dave Sims' insidiousness in that he, in his writing and his writing about women, he has a bit of a persecution complex. And this might almost seem a little underhanded, like a little like, "Ooh, look at you, you have your big mansion or whatever." I don't know. Maybe I'm bringing a little bit to that. Um,
Yeah, maybe so. And maybe it is a little bit of something like comparing, when we see where Cerebus lives, it's a black and white place that's full of diners and like, it's a very real and very tangible representation of like a city block. And that's Cerebus's territory. And when we see where Spawn lives, it's all very, once again, kind of traditional superhero cartooning. Looks a lot like other Spawn pages we've seen. We've got a terrible pair of baby's hands on one page. I think maybe the message from Dave Sim is not so much as patronizing as it may seem, but more telling Todd, like, hey, you found the formula and it's taking you where you want to go. So stick with it.
yeah,
Your creator never sold you, and that's why you have all these dreams. And I think that's a message from him to say, like, you did it. Don't be an idiot and turn around and like sell Spawn to Marvel. Don't sell Image. Don't sell Wildstorm to
well,
DEC.
Wildstorm doesn't exist quite yet,
Yeah.
so
No, it's not a message, and that was me taking the piss.
but yeah, Spawn says like, that it feels like he's dreaming. Cerebus is a little antagonistic. Like I guess it's partly because of the way the character's always drawn. His eyes are kind of, his
Yeah.
brow is always furrowed and he looks kind of angry.
He's also
And so,
being a little sarcastic with his Winston Churchill line and stuff.
yeah, he says you'll get used to it. And Spawn has a lot of questions for him, but Cerebus has things to do. He'll
He's
be
going
in
to a
after the
Maple
Leafs
Leafs
game.
game.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think it's a message to him saying, like, this is your world, though.
right.
Dave Sim lives in black and white and gray land, which is something Cerebus says earlier in the issue, which is something that I think, that weird black and whiteness of Dave Sim's personality comes out in a few years. One of the things that's kind of tragic about this issue is that it's not a bad issue of Spawn.
No,
There's
it's
some
not.
interesting prose. Dave Sim was a very well regarded creator for a long time and a very well regarded cartoonist in particular.
Yeah.
And it's a shame to me that he then went on to be so hurtful and that channeled even his creative drive into being hurtful.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that you can't then help but look back at his work. And especially for somebody who works in satire, right?
Right.
With so much of his work, you get to say like, oh, but he's being edgy and satirical, and like he's having characters say things that like maybe he couldn't really say, and then you start to realize like he was
How
in
much of
control of
it,
this entire thing, and how much of this is stuff he really believes.
right.
Yes, he is using his characters as a mouthpiece for some of this stuff.
How much is him, trying to take the wind out of those sails, and how
Right,
much of it is him using the label of satire to pull a punch he's actually trying to throw?
right. This issue, Cerebus leaves Spawn and says like, force a crowd and tell Wanda I say hi. And Spawn's still holding Cyan. He's walking down the stairs. He hangs up the phone. You hear Wanda come home. She says, "Hi, honey, I'm home. Did you have a nice day?" He says, "Yes, Wanda. Yes, I did. I had a bad dream, I think, but it's best not to think about it."
And
Which has
that's,
been Cerebus's line kind of this entire time, which I see that as a very sad line.
I think it's also Todd saying in some ways, like, my time in that nightmare is behind me. It's best not to think about the shitty things that I feel happened to me when I was creating Spider-Man and
Right.
now like creating the comic, not the character, of course. And now it's best for me to focus on this moment right now where I'm in this dream world living with my wife and daughter who I love in a house full of hockey cards with a hot tub, a great view of Mount Hood. That's really where it ends. It doesn't really give us a resolution. We assume that, we're left to assume that this just kind of fits somewhere in Spawn's greater story, probably in that panel where he's seen kind of dreaming that very distinctive page of all the arms reaching out of the bars. And we're left with this kind of big declarative statement at the end.
Yeah. Spawn is trademark and copyright Todd McFarlane. Cerebus is trademark and copyright Dave Sim. Forever.
Forever.
Next, Frank Miller. Yeah, I mean that's Spawn number 10. It, like you said, it's really not a bad issue. It does put right on the page all the stuff that Todd, we brought up the letters columns, and I've been tracking down all these individual issues
Yeah.
because I'm having a really good time with the letters column, because it does give us some insight into the way that Todd thinks. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that we hear him talking about in at Comic-Con panels now, and in his sort of inspirations for why he created Spawn in the first place. It really does help you to understand that it is a lot more political for him than what Spawn has been to this point.
But it's the only kind of politics that Todd consistently projects, which is
Right.
creators' rights, ownership, in some ways labor rights. He did try to unionize at Marvel, I believe, or maybe just in the industry at large. So there is some of that labor's rights. But it's hard to know how he relates to Dave Sim as a person rather than just as a fellow creator. It's hard
Right.
to get a sense of how any of their other politics might align, because also it's kind of one of those, and you can maybe call it a boys club sort of mentality that existed very heavily in the 90s in particular, where if you were in your camp of comics, be it in at Marvel slash DC, superhero mainstream, or you're on the creator owned side, be it on the fringes or as a creator like Todd McFarlane, there's a sense of like, we're all on a team here, team spirit, we got to stick together. And that seems to be the thing that Todd cares about sharing with Dave Sim. And you mentioned to me before we started recording that they did work together on a reprint of this issue, which I guess
Yeah.
if you're gonna reprint it, you have to, because like it says, it's trademark Dave Sim. He owns the character and he created the script for this issue. The fact that they go a little further than that, and you might have more details about how much further it went than just a reprint.
Yeah, it was like a Kickstarter for a reprint of this issue where Dave Sim redrew Cerebus in the panels that Cerebus appears. There's also some new like Cerebus Spawn art from Dave Sim. It came out in 2020. It would have been the first new thing that he had done since the end of Cerebus in 2004.
Yeah,
It's again unclear what, I mean. Todd does contribute a new cover to it.
I think he did his own miniseries sometime after Cerebus that like failed really hard because it was extremely tough. I could be wrong. It might have been during the runtime of Cerebus, but
Mm,
I remember it happening. I didn't read it. Just
yeah.
wanted to note that for anybody who was firing up their email.
Yeah, to my knowledge, that's kind of the last time they worked together. Again, it's not like anybody asks Todd about all of the controversy
Right.
surrounding Dave Sim.
So we don't know.
I kind of would like to. I'm a little curious, and I do, but I do think that it would land in the, you know, the sort of anti-feminist, anti-women diatribes that really exist in the back end, the last 100 issues ish of Cerebus. Those don't start until after this issue.
Right.
And so Dave Sim's still somebody who's in relatively good standing as
In
far
the
as I can
industry, yeah.
understand, in the industry at the time.
So their reunion in 2020 for reprinting it a little, like they did some extra content for it. I think you said Dave Sim maybe redrew some portions.
Yeah.
I get the sense that that would be Todd McFarlane saying it's just business, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
exactly.
all, which ultimately it's all about money to him too in the end, which I think is sort of the irony of that page of the Violator, all mashed up with Lady Justice covered in money. I think it's a little bit of the irony of his creator owned ethos that the last time I saw him speak on a panel, one of his big messages was that a great way to succeed is by getting multimedia adaptations of your work and getting, like movie or TV
Get the check. Yeah.
studios getting the check. I think it's a little interesting that the message of this issue is never sell out. And, ultimately Todd kind of learns, I think, as we all do, that if you want to reach that $3 million baseball collector echelon, you kind of have to a little bit. Now, he does it a lot on his own with the toys and stuff like that. But even that, I think it's interesting that he's now doing toys for DC Comics, and you're getting to see like the Todd McFarlane version of DC. Mixed results there. But
I do think though he sees that as a win. They couldn't kill him.
oh,
It
absolutely.
was quite literally, we can't beat him, join him, because now every single Batman toy and Superman toy and whatever has a Spawn logo on it.
Yeah, has his name
And
on it, has a
that
Todd
is
McFarlane Spawn
nuts.
logo on it. It is. And I don't think it's a matter of cognitive dissonance of him being like, well, no,
No.
that totally square. I think it's a matter of him leaning into business and the business side of business. Wow, what a sentence. Especially through learning the hard way through lawsuits that he has to do things a certain way
Yeah.
to have the money he wants and protect himself,
Yeah.
and evolving as a businessman more than as an advocate necessarily of creators' rights.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some interesting stuff in the spawning ground, the letters pages of this issue. So a lot of folks, these are usually about 2 issues behind. So these are folks writing in about issue 8, about the Alan Moore issue.
Which we
People
covered,
saying,
I believe, on episode. It's on an early episode 2,
yeah,
where we discussed the 2-part saga of Billy Kincaid.
there was apparently there was an ongoing war of words between Image Comics and John Byrne around this time.
Oh, great! John Byrne, another guy who's cool to hear from, or as Chris Claremont calls him, the Canadian.
We won't get into John Byrne, although we do know that he is essential to Todd's origin story a little bit.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
You can get my opinion from how I just talked about him. So
John Byrne apparently said that Image is turning into a stable of sameness in style and product. And this fan is kind of going off like, Rob Liefeld can't draw very well. These are gimmick books, millions sold of first issues by hot artists, but everything just has 10 issues of something that'll never be worth anything. Rarity is what makes something expensive, not that you print a million copies of it, whatever. That said, he says, like, listen, before I'm touted as an image basher, I just want to say out of the 3 books I buy each and every month, Spawn is one of them. Spawn is fun, exciting, and easily read. It's not high ordered literature, it's just fun. Todd has grown from a messy stylist to a solid artist, which is a funny way to think about Todd's art, because I would argue that he just got to a point where he started experimenting. It's never that he was a messy stylist, is that he got bored of drawing. He was good enough to draw house style, and he was like, I don't feel like drawing house style anymore. I want to do something else. And I
right,
think in his like experimentation, it does push visual language of this era of comics forward a little bit. I think
it
that's why
does.
we consider him above Liefeld if we have to start ranking, image
Oh
artists.
God, I don't even. I'm not going to even say his name again because that's twice now. Yeah, I also think it's funny coming from John Byrne, whose style is very much his own and is very much considered a step forward from a lot of the other artists that were doing house style in his day. I think he's mad because he's not being talked about as much anymore at this time. And I hate to say he's just jealous. Haters are just jealous. But also, I mean, he's John fucking Byrne.
I think that what I really like though is Todd's whole response to this. So he said, these feuds perplex me just as much as they do you, Robin. My reason for quitting Marvel Comics was that I thought the system was wrong in the way that it handles the creative people who work for it. What stuns me more than anything is the amount of animosity we get from our fellow peers. I'm not talking about people who do black and white, non independent comics. I'm talking about the guys who do the exact same stuff as we do. John Byrne writes and draws superhero comic books. As a matter of fact, John's work influenced many of the guys who work for Image, and we've publicly stated this. But instead of welcoming us to the fold, he's taken our popularity as a personal slight against him. None of us have any control over our popularity. It's you, our readers, who control our careers. Instead of feeling like a proud papa and knowing that his examples were special enough for us to want to try and learn his trade, he makes it seem like what we do is an attack against him. My frustration is that while I'm trying to continually defend my turf against the big conglomerates, I'm continually getting interference from those who, in some sense, created us in the first place. The line about our books are not the best out there is a moot point. Rob never said he's the best artist, and I never said I was a great writer, but we did say that we didn't like our working conditions, so we decided to change them. Why this seems to be such a big concern for so many people in our business, even though thousands of people across the world do it every day, is beyond me. Trying to find a job in a comfortable atmosphere should not be such a controversial subject. On the other hand, if these guys want to keep taking potshots at my friends and myself, then I will go to war for them.
I have a lot to say in response to that. I'll try to. I think that's wow. I think that's an opinion that was extremely unpopular to express at the time, which
Yeah,
is that comics are labor, comics are a business, comics are work that has to be done by human beings to exist. And those human beings deserve better conditions. And if those better conditions mean that we're not going to be exploiting creators to put out books that are the quote unquote best, then we're just going to keep doing our jobs because the people who are our customers and our market are buying them and paying our bills better than they were when we were, quote unquote, selling out or whatever at Marvel.
yeah,
I think that's an opinion that's become more popular now. I think a lot of people, especially in a specific old guard of comics, kind of would have seen John Byrne, perhaps maybe even in particular, would have seen the idea that comics are a business, etc., as the death of comics as art. I think that's something that was struggled with a lot, especially with the speculation boom that really was built on an inflated concept of what speculation even means.
right.
But I think that the idea that that's what comics are and what comics should be on some level was very unpopular at the time. I think now, especially in the age of Twitter, there's a certain generation of creators that have really made the transition and are working in a transitional period where we're learning that even more and more and prioritizing that more and more. I think that, frankly, in the sense that I believe that art is something that's created by sentient beings to express something, I think that it's also a product and it also is labor to create it. And I think that the people who do create it deserve to have commensurate compensation and certainly, protections for their health and their safety and their careers as they go on. So kind of think, base Todd at the time.
For real. One thing I love about these letters responses is that he's very consistent. He's very consistent with this is why I started Image Comics. This is why I got out of Marvel. This is why I do Spawn. You don't have to like it. Just don't read it. If you don't think it's good, don't read it. If you think it's bad and you keep buying it, I'm gonna keep making it, and I'm laughing all the way to the bank because you paid my bills and you are making sure that I can keep doing this. And he's right that like he doesn't do it. He's annoyed. Like I understand why he's annoyed that like the old guard is not like cool. You did a thing that we couldn't do.
Right.
I understand it, and I understand because that sort of probably old that old head mentality is like, well, they pay you a paycheck, so you
Right.
should be thankful.
Also, interesting counterpoint to the issue we just read.
Yeah,
The letters column, Todd being consistent in it and having this view of creators' rights, I think, is driven by the idea that if you're buying this, I'm going to keep making it. And you can see the relationship that already existed between quote unquote fans as customers and, in their minds, stewards of the characters that are being created by other people,
yeah,
almost seeing themselves as those people with the hoods on and their hands bound crying at the state of the characters.
hmm
You already see it, the burgeoning state of it, with people, trying to wring hands over the quote unquote quality of the comics and saying this. Todd doesn't get why people are saying this because his mentality is if you don't like it, don't buy it.
Right.
Whereas there's a toxic fan mentality that I think that's been burgeoning for a long time in the industry by this point, but is making itself very known thanks to like speculation booms and the quality of and wide breadth of comics that are coming out. People thinking that if you don't like it, don't buy it is stupid. That's cucked. What you have to do is, if you don't like it,
And all the
buy it
money.
forever and constantly complain about it because you think you then have ownership over it in
Right.
some way.
Which we've seen companies, not in comics specifically, I guess, but the Sonic thing with Sonic the Hedgehog's first design looking terrible, but then they
Sometimes feedback is important to listen to, and sometimes it's criticism. Sometimes it's just a bunch of people going like, why is there a girl here? You know,
I've brought up Brand New Day and One More Day already
Dave
on this
Sim.
podcast. People being like, why did you get rid of the marriage and blah, blah, blah. Because we got 15 years of better Spider-Man stories than we would have
I mean,
otherwise. Like maybe not than we
opinion, but
would
I
have,
agree.
maybe not than we would have otherwise, but based on where the character was when that happened versus like at least some of the stuff that happened after and the
There
sales of
was,
those books, you kind of can't argue with it that much.
and that's the thing that, kind of is the point of this, is that like sales is always going to be what drives the
Everything.
story. Doomsday. I'm not going to say that was creatively bankrupt, because it was an idea that they had that was like, what if we did this? Could we?
Yeah.
Which kind of on its own does challenge some of the concepts of being a creator at the time. But the way that DC Comics ran with it and marketed it from there certainly made it a sales event and not necessarily just a what if creative endeavor. I mean, not to, go too deep into like a side tangent here, but like part of the reason I'm a comic journalist today is because when I was 8 years old, my mom showed me a copy of the Atlanta Journal Constitution that had an article in it talking about the death of Superman. And I realized that people can write about superheroes for a living, and that's just one step on my personal journey.
Yeah.
But like, I think that that's interesting that it was that widely publicized and that important, whereas now, like, fucking, I don't know, Thor dies every month. Like, it's not. There was Al Ewing did a comic where Hulk died every issue. The
Yeah.
X-Men, don't
X-Men
die.
can't die right now.
It's just a whole. It's you just see how that well keeps getting dried, and when the gimmick dries up, they find a new
Well, the problem
sales
is,
driver.
that they're not polybagging their issues anymore. How
Well,
many?
that's true.
How
Well,
many
now they
polybag?
are, thanks to Blood
Well,
Hunt.
that's true.
Timestamp.
How many? How many issues? How many polybagged issues of Death of Superman do you still have?
A lot,
I
honestly. We
I
saw him
definitely
at the
have like
saw a whole bin
8.
of them at the Goodwill. And my mom was like, "Oh, these are probably worth something," and I wasn't like, I was too hyped up on it at the time to think like, if they were worth something, they wouldn't be selling them for $2 each at the Goodwill. But I have them, and I was thankful for them. I got one to read and one to keep in the sleeve, and and
There
they
was
were
the
honestly
there was the
fun
black
comics.
one and the white one, right? The white one is when he comes back. I think
Yeah,
that's
there were a
Superman
couple. I think I had the
350.
return
Yeah.
three, yeah, something like that.
Anyway,
Anyway, you were just digging into our childhoods here, but that's kind of what this is about. How Spawn relates to the environment of comics that we grew up in and that
that
we
led us
learned
here.
about comics in. Yeah, that led us to doing Spawnography.
Hell yeah. Well, listen, this has been Spawn number 10. You have any closing thoughts on this issue? I think we pretty much talked about everything I wanted to.
Yeah, I think Spawn is Jesus, and I think that our closing statement still rings true. For Todd so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Spawn.
Yep. Next week, Spawn number 11. Here is the solicit text from the back of Spawn number 10. They
Oh
come by
boy.
the hundreds, and they've got all the guns in the world. All they're after is a rotten patch of cracked pavement, and all that's on it are drunks and defamers and losers. But the killers don't get it. These are Spawn's people, and this is his home. Written by Frank Miller. Pencils and inks
Wait,
by Todd McFarlane, with pull-out poster by Jeff Darrow.
you're saying that concept? Wait, Frank Miller would write something like that?
They got all the guns in the
Anyway,
world.
they sure do.
Anyway, this has been another episode of Spawnography. I am your host, Pierce. You can find me on, I guess, Twitter at plightning and on Instagram at Spawnography. And you can send us an email at spawnographypod@gmail.com if you hate us or love us or want to complain about John burned us or anything else. George, where can people find you?
My name's George. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, and you can find my writing every livelong day at newsarama.com, and I'm rarely on social media at Crypt Trash.
Sweet. Till next week.
See you then. Spawniverse!